The Mediterranean wind carried secrets through the narrow streets of Palermo, whispers that had become legend. In the shadowed cafes and marble corridors of Sicily's most powerful families, one story repeated itself like a prayer or a warning. No woman who married into the De Luca Empire lived past 30, not one. Giuliana Ferraro had heard this story 1,000 times before she met Massimo. Her mother had told it to her, her aunts had repeated it during family dinners, and the old women in the neighborhood had crossed themselves whenever his name was mentioned. The curse, they called it. Not a coincidence, not tragedy. A curse written in blood and sealed by fate itself. But Giuliana was different from the women of Palermo who feared whispers and shadows. She was a woman who read books in libraries when other girls her age were learning to cook. She was a woman who asked questions instead of accepting answers. She was a woman who believed that fate was something you negotiated with, not something you surrendered to. When she first saw Massimo De Luca, it was at a gallery opening in Mondello. He stood alone beneath a Caravaggio painting, a man in his early 40s whose presence seemed to reshape the space around him. Not because of the guards discreetly positioned throughout the room, not because of the way conversation stopped when he entered, but because of something quieter, a gravity, a weight of choices made and consequences accepted. He wore his power like other men wore cologne, naturally, without thought, impossible to ignore. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds. That was all it took. Giuliana was not naive. She knew who Massimo De Luca was. She knew about the businesses that operated in the shadows of legitimate commerce. She knew about the families he had destroyed and the men who had disappeared. She knew everything that the newspapers hinted at and the streets whispered. And somehow, knowing all of this, she could not look away. The courtship that followed was unlike anything the Palermo elite had ever witnessed. Massimo pursued her with the same precision he applied to everything, methodical, relentless, inevitable. He appeared at her university lectures. He sent her books she had mentioned in passing, each one wrapped in expensive paper with handwritten notes inside. He orchestrated coincidental encounters at restaurants where she dined with friends, always maintaining distance, always watching. Giuliana could have run. A part of her wanted to, but another part, the part that had always felt trapped by the small expectations of her small world, recognized something in him, a man who had transcended the ordinary, a man who had bent reality to his will, a man who, despite everything she knew about him, looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world of illusions. When he finally approached her directly, it was not at a glamorous event or chance encounter. It was in the rain, outside the university library, when she was struggling to keep her books dry and her composure intact. He simply appeared beside her, offering an umbrella, and spoke in a voice that was almost gentle. The conversation lasted 4 hours. They walked through the rain-soaked streets of Palermo, and he told her things that powerful men do not tell. He spoke about loneliness, about the weight of decisions that destroyed families, about the way trust becomes a luxury when power makes you a target, about the women before her. There were 3 of them. Isabella, who died in a car explosion meant for him. The bomb was triggered by a rival family testing his defenses. Lucia, who was kidnapped and never returned, lost to a ransom exchange that went catastrophically wrong. And Sophia, his most recent wife, who simply woke up one morning and couldn't recognize the world anymore. The stress, the fear, the constant proximity to death had fractured her mind. She lived now in a facility in Switzerland, a ghost in a living body, and Massimo visited her every month, carrying the weight of knowing that his love had destroyed her. He told Giuliana all of this with the kind of honesty that only comes from a man who has nothing left to hide. And then he said something that would echo through every moment that followed. "I am cursed. Every woman I have loved has paid for it. You should run from me, Giuliana. You should run so far and so fast that my name never reaches your ears again." But Juliana, standing in the Palermo rain with her books against her chest and water dripping from her hair, had smiled, and she had said, "Then I'll just have to be the first to live." The marriage took place 3 months later. Not a grand spectacle. Massimo was too careful for that, too aware that public celebrations attracted attention and opportunity for those who wished him harm. Instead, it was a small ceremony in a private chapel, with only the most trusted members of both families present. Juliana wore white, and she looked like she was walking toward her own execution, or her salvation. Perhaps both. That wedding night was the moment everything changed. As Massimo held her in their bedroom in the villa overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, surrounded by guards and walls and all the protective architecture of his empire, he had trembled. This man who had made other men tremble had held his new wife and allowed himself to be vulnerable. "Every woman I've ever loved has died because of me," he had whispered into her hair. And Juliana, understanding the weight of what he was confessing, had responded not with fear but with defiance. "Then I'll just have to be the first to live." The first year was a baptism by fire. Juliana had entered a world that operated by rules she had never encountered in her books or her carefully ordered university life. The De Luca villa was a fortress disguised as elegance. Every window was reinforced. Every entrance had multiple checkpoints. Every room had escape routes that she gradually learned, committing them to memory the way other wives might memorize their husband's favorite meals. She learned to recognize the difference between a guard assigned to protect and a guard assigned to watch. She learned the signals that meant danger was approaching, the way Massimo's men would subtly position themselves, the manner in which his phone calls would become shorter and more urgent. She learned the language of threat that existed beneath the surface of daily life, and she learned the history of the curse. Isabella, the first wife, had been young and beautiful and terrified of the world that had swallowed her. She had requested larger and larger security details, insisting on isolation, demanding that Massimo choose between her and his empire. The car explosion came on a Tuesday afternoon while she was being driven to a hair appointment. The investigation concluded it was the Catalano family, testing whether Massimo's defenses could be penetrated. They could. Isabella could not survive the answer. Lucia, the second wife, had been different, educated, cultured, a woman who believed she could navigate the shadows through intelligence and charm. She had made the mistake of reaching out to someone she thought was a neutral party, an old family friend who might help broker peace between the warring factions. That contact had been reported. Lucia was taken as leverage in a negotiation that Massimo ultimately refused to submit to. Her body was found 3 weeks later in the Mondello harbor, weighted down with stones. The Russo family had left a calling card, a message written in blood. "This is what happens when you forget your place." Sophia, the third wife, had lasted the longest, 5 years. She had given Massimo a daughter, a beautiful girl named Elena, with his dark eyes and her mother's gentle temperament. And then, gradually, Sophia's mind had begun to fracture under the accumulation of fear, the endless awareness that death could arrive at any moment in any form. She would wake up screaming from nightmares. She would forget where she was. She would stare out windows for hours, watching the guards, convinced that her own husband's men had been sent to kill her. The breaking point came when she tried to run away with Elena, only to be brought back by Massimo's security, not as punishment, but as protection. That single moment of forced captivity had shattered whatever remained of her sanity. This was the history that Juliana absorbed during her first months as the fourth wife. This was the shadow that fell across every dinner, every moment of intimacy, every night she fell asleep beside a man whose love had become a death sentence for every woman who had accepted it. But Juliana did not break. Instead, she changed everything. She began by refusing the isolation that had destroyed her predecessors. Where Isabella had hidden behind walls and Lucia had tried to negotiate with vipers, Juliana moved through the city. She went to markets. She attended university lectures, not as a student, but as a researcher, auditing classes on economics and political science and history. She made friends among the merchants and shopkeepers, the professors and activists. She created a world outside the villa that was real and tangible and separate from the empire that sustained her. Massimo, initially alarmed by her independence, gradually came to understand what she was doing. She was not denying the danger, she was contextualizing it. She was refusing to let it become the entire universe. She was insisting on being more than just a wife of a mafia boss. She was insisting on being alive. She also began to study the business itself. With careful subtlety, she asked questions. She listened to conversations. She read the documents that Massimo left on his desk, memorizing names and territories and the complex web of relationships that held his empire together. She came to understand that the power wielded by men like Massimo was not absolute. It was fragile, dependent on reputation and fear, and the careful balance of alliances that could shift like sand. And she came to understand something else, something that perhaps only an outsider could see. The curse was not supernatural, it was structural. The wives died, not because of fate, but because they responded to the situation with the only strategies available to them: isolation, submission, desperation. The curse was self-fulfilling, written into the expectations of what a woman in her position should do and be. So Juliana did something else entirely. She became Massimo's counselor. It started small. She would mention casually how the Catalano family had been facing pressure from the Port Authority, how their legitimate business was vulnerable. She would observe that the Russo family had a young son who was ambitious and restless, potentially a source of instability within their hierarchy. She would point out that the way Massimo's men were handling a particular situation was creating unnecessary resentment, that a different approach might yield better long-term results. At first, Massimo dismissed these observations, but over time he began to listen, and over time he began to implement her suggestions. The changes were subtle, nothing that would draw attention or suggest that his decisions were being influenced by a woman, but they were effective. Territory disputes that had seemed intractable began to resolve themselves. Rival families that had been on the verge of all-out war suddenly found reasons to negotiate. Slowly, Juliana became more than a wife. She became a strategic asset. She bore him a son, a beautiful boy named Marco, who had her eyes and his father's fierce intelligence. And unlike the way Sophia's child had deepened her descent into fear, Juliana's motherhood only strengthened her position. She was no longer just a woman in a dangerous world. She was a mother protecting her child, and that gave her decisions a clarity and purpose that had been absent in the lives of her predecessors. By the 5th year of their marriage, the whispers in Palermo had begun to change. The curse was not broken. It was simply becoming a historical fact rather than an active threat. The mafia boss had a wife who survived. She had given him a son. She moved through the city with purpose and intelligence. She was, against all odds and all precedent, alive. But survival in Palermo is never permanent. And the longer Juliana lived, the more dangerous that became. The warning came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a contact whose name Juliana never learned. A message passed through a flower vendor in the market where she bought roses every week. One sentence, in careful handwriting: "The peace is ending. The families are choosing sides. Your husband is vulnerable." Massimo already knew. He had felt the shift in the territories, the subtle changes in communication patterns, the way certain men had stopped taking his calls. The delicate balance he had maintained through intelligence and strategic concessions was collapsing. A new coalition was forming, the Catalano family, the Russo family, and a younger faction that had grown impatient with the old order. They had a plan. They had decided that Massimo De Luca needed to be removed. The decision came from old calculations and new ambitions. Massimo had ruled for too long. He had made concessions that the younger men considered weakness. Most importantly, he had accumulated wealth and territory that other families believed they deserved. The conspiracy had been months in the making, discussed in whispered conversations in back rooms and coded messages sent through intermediaries. What none of the conspirators understood was that Massimo's new wife had access to information networks that extended far beyond the traditional structures of power. It was Giuliana who had first identified the alliance forming. It was Giuliana who had tracked the pattern of meetings and contacts, who had pieced together information from the merchants she had befriended and the conversations she had overheard. And it was Giuliana who had prepared for this moment, understanding that despite everything she had achieved, her husband's position had a fundamental weakness. His enemies vastly outnumbered his allies. They had 6 days. That was how long Massimo believed they had before the strike was scheduled. 6 days to reinforce alliances, to move assets, to prepare defenses. But in those 6 days, something shifted. The Catalano family, anxious and eager, decided to move ahead of schedule. They did not want to risk Massimo discovering the full scope of the conspiracy and responding with preemptive action. They decided that the attack would come on Saturday night, during a private dinner party that Massimo was hosting for members of his inner circle. The target was not just Massimo. The conspirators understood that a dead man could be martyred, that his organization could survive his death and eventually seek revenge. Instead, their plan was more comprehensive. Eliminate Massimo, eliminate his heir, and neutralize the remaining leadership structure in a single coordinated strike. They would present themselves as the new order, the men who had restored stability to Sicily by removing an aging boss who had become a liability. The hitmen were not local. That was the crucial detail that later analysis would reveal. They were brought in from Naples, men without connections to the local ecosystem, men who would have no hesitation about the violence required. 20 of them, armed and trained, organized into teams with specific targets and objectives. Giuliana learned about the accelerated timeline on Thursday evening. A contact, a woman who worked in administration at a government building and who Giuliana had befriended through careful attention and genuine kindness, passed along information that had been shared with a police contact investigating organized crime. The attack would come on Saturday, 2 days. She told Massimo immediately. He received the news with a calmness that terrified her more than any outward panic would have. He simply nodded, made several phone calls using his most secure line, and then turned to her and said nothing. His silence was acknowledgement that they had reached a point where the old rules no longer applied, where strategy and intelligence could only accomplish so much against overwhelming force. Saturday came with a peculiar brightness. The sky was cloudless, the sea was calm. Giuliana remembers thinking that it seemed wrong, that a day so potentially catastrophic should arrive cloaked in beauty rather than storm. She moved through the villa with the precision of someone operating on automatic systems, making sure Marco was ready for bed, checking that the household staff had clear instructions, confirming escape routes one final time. The dinner party began at 8 o'clock. Massimo's inner circle, the men he trusted most, the men who would inherit what remained if he did not survive the night, gathered in the dining room. There were 8 of them, plus Massimo. The villa was lit warmly. Wine was served. The conversation turned to business matters, to the state of the territories and the distribution of resources. Everything appeared normal, except for the way the men kept checking their phones and the subtle signals that passed between them when guards reported on positions outside. At 10:47 p.m., the first shots came. The hitmen came in hard and fast, using explosives to breach the villa's outer perimeter and then flooding through with military precision. They had studied the layout. They knew the positions of the guards. They had planned for resistance and had brought the kind of firepower that made resistance almost irrelevant. Massimo's security team fought with desperation but had not anticipated the scale of the assault. The conspiracy had kept its true scope hidden, even from its own executing forces. 30 men was all they actually deployed, not 20. They came from multiple directions simultaneously. They knew which guards were most effective and had specifically assigned teams to eliminate them first. In the minutes after the initial assault began, chaos consumed the villa. The dinner guests scrambled for safety. The guards returned fire, but were rapidly overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. And in that moment of absolute crisis, in that moment when every precedent suggested that this night would end exactly as the curse had always promised, Juliana moved. She had mapped the villa months earlier, studying its construction, identifying the hidden passages that had been built decades ago when Mafia bosses needed escape routes. There was a passage that ran beneath the wine cellar, a tunnel that connected to a building 3 blocks away, a route that no security analysis would have found because it predated modern surveillance systems and had been intentionally left unmapped in any official documents. She appeared in the dining room, where Massimo and his remaining guards were making their final stand against impossible odds. She did not hesitate or question or doubt. She simply moved to her husband, took his hand, and pulled him toward the passage. He might have resisted. His pride might have demanded that he face his enemies head-on. But in that moment, he made a different choice. He chose her. He chose survival. He chose to believe that she could accomplish what her words had promised 5 years earlier. The passage was narrow and dark. Behind them, the sound of gunfire echoed through the villa. Ahead of them was survival, or another form of death. Juliana moved through the darkness with the certainty of someone who had memorized every turn, every elevation change, every detail of this route that had been her secret insurance policy. But fate had one final test prepared. As they emerged into the connecting building, as they began to believe they might actually reach the exit that led to the street, they encountered him. One of the conspirators had anticipated this route, not through superior intelligence, but through the kind of paranoid thinking that accompanies violent betrayal. He stood in the darkened hallway with his gun drawn, blocking the path to safety. He was one of Massimo's oldest associates, a man who had been with him for 20 years, a man whose name Massimo had spoken with affection just hours earlier. The betrayer's expression was a mixture of guilt and resolution. He had been promised a significant increase in territory and authority if Massimo died. He had been told this was the future, and now he had a choice to make. Let them pass and face the consequences from the conspirators, or fulfill his part of the agreement by executing the man he had once called friend. He raised the gun, but Juliana moved faster than anyone would have believed a woman in evening dress could move. She had studied not just the layout of the villa, but the positions of the guards, the placement of objects, the physics of her surroundings. She had turned her vulnerability into expertise, her fear into preparation. She had something that the conspirators had not anticipated. She had nothing to lose anymore. What happened in the next 5 seconds would become the detail that changed everything. The betrayer would later claim to the police, who found him unconscious in that hallway, that she had somehow disarmed him. The security footage, reviewed by investigators, would show a woman moving with precise determination, using his own weapon against him, in a moment where desperation and preparation converged into something resembling competence. He was knocked unconscious. He did not die. That detail would matter greatly in the investigation that followed. They ran. They burst out of the building into the Palermo night, where Massimo's most trusted driver was waiting in a car 3 blocks away, a detail that only Giuliana had arranged, a final insurance policy that had been prepared months in advance. The car was already moving when they reached it, already heading away from the villa, already disappearing into the network of small streets that comprised the city's nervous system. Behind them, the villa burned. The conspiracy was unraveling into chaos. The different families were already beginning to blame each other for the failure to completely eliminate Massimo and his heir. The hitmen, realizing that their target had escaped and that their payment would likely never materialize, were beginning to negotiate for their own safety. And in the hours that followed, as dawn approached and Palermo slowly woke to news of the attack, the story that would come to define the next era began to form. The dawn broke gold and crimson over Sicily, painting the sea in colors that seemed unfit for a night that had changed everything. Massimo and Giuliana sat in a small apartment in the Vucciria neighborhood, in a building owned by a merchant whose life Giuliana had quietly saved years earlier through a loan provided at exactly the moment when his business was collapsing. No questions asked, no price demanded, just kindness, the kind of kindness that creates bonds deeper than blood. The news was already spreading through the city. The De Luca villa had been attacked by a rival coalition. The boss had escaped. His security team had suffered significant casualties. The conspirators were turning on each other, each faction blaming the others for the intelligence failure that had allowed Massimo to survive. But there was another detail spreading through the whispers of Palermo, the kind of story that would become legend within hours. They were saying that Giuliana had saved him, that she had moved through the villa with knowledge that seemed impossible for a woman who had been married only 5 years, that she had disarmed an armed man, that she had walked her husband through the fire and brought him out the other side alive. The story was already being modified by telling and retelling, already becoming myth, even as the woman who had lived it sat in silence, drinking coffee that the merchant's wife had prepared. The investigation that followed was complicated by the fact that Massimo had significant influence with multiple branches of law enforcement. The official story released by the police was that the attack had been an internal dispute between rival families, that it had resulted from miscommunication and escalating tensions, that while regrettable, it was ultimately a problem that would be resolved within existing criminal hierarchies. No mention was made of the conspiracy, no names were provided. No criminal charges were filed against the conspirators, several of whom, in the chaos that followed, had begun to understand that they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The Catalano family publicly distanced themselves from the attack, claiming that rogue elements within their organization had acted without authorization. The Russo family issued a similar statement. The younger faction simply dispersed, its members understanding that they had backed the wrong strategy and would now need to negotiate new terms with a man who had proven that he could not be easily eliminated. Within 2 weeks, a new arrangement had been established. Massimo, rather than crushing his enemies in revenge, instead offered them terms. Territory reductions, yes. Reduced autonomy, certainly, but survival, and crucially the promise that if they accepted these new terms, the conspiracy would be forgotten. The attack would not be avenged. The men who had been complicit would not be hunted. In exchange, the new order would be respected, and peace would be restored. It was a brilliant maneuver, born not from Massimo's mind, but from the strategic counsel of the wife he had almost lost. By offering survival to the conspirators rather than death, Massimo guaranteed that no future retaliation would occur. He also demonstrated to the entire Sicilian underworld that he was a different kind of boss, one who was strong enough to show mercy, wise enough to break cycles of revenge, and secure enough in his power that he did not need to demonstrate it through violence. The other families began to re-establish relationships with him. The younger men who had been recruited into the conspiracy were absorbed into Massimo's organization, given opportunities and resources in exchange for their loyalty. The disrupted peace was restored, and more importantly, it was restored in a way that actually proved stronger than what had existed before. But the most important change was invisible, recorded only in the stories that people told each other. Massimo began to withdraw from active management of the business. He placed trusted lieutenants in charge of day-to-day operations. He spent more time with his family. He was seen increasingly consulting with his wife, not in secret, not in the hidden way that would suggest impropriety, but openly, visibly. And when major decisions were made, the outcomes were consistently intelligent, consistently strategic, consistently effective. The men who worked for Massimo came to understand that the woman he had married was not a vulnerability or a weakness, but an asset. And more than that, she had proven that she would die for him, that she would fight for him, that she was as committed to his survival as any warrior could be. Respect, the currency of the underworld, flows toward competence and commitment. Giuliana had demonstrated both. 6 months after the attack, a visitor came to the villa where Massimo and Giuliana now lived with their children. It was the betrayer, the man who had been standing in that hallway with the gun, the man whose conscience and fear had apparently reached an equilibrium that made continued collaboration with the conspirators untenable. He asked for an audience with Massimo. What followed was a private conversation that lasted 40 minutes. When the betrayer emerged, his expression was unreadable. Later, Massimo explained to Giuliana what had transpired. The man had come to ask for forgiveness, to confess the conspiracy, to provide names and details in exchange for mercy, and Massimo had granted it. Not because Massimo had become soft or forgiving by nature, but because Giuliana had taught him that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is not destruction, but redemption, if offered carefully, strategically, and only to those who demonstrate genuine remorse. The betrayer left Sicily the next day. He was given money, a new identity, and a promise of safety as long as he remained far from Sicily and silent about what he had witnessed. It was an expensive mercy, but it was also a message to everyone who heard the story. Massimo De Luca had learned something from his wife. He had learned that sometimes breaking the cycle was more powerful than continuing it. As the seasons turned and the year progressed, the story of what had happened on that Saturday night transformed into something larger than the simple facts of the event. The narrative that emerged in the whispers of Palermo was about more than just a successful escape or a well-executed strategy. It was about transformation. They said that Giuliana had not just saved Massimo that night. They said she had saved him years earlier, through the way she lived, through the choices she made, through her refusal to accept the curse as inevitable. They said that her greatest act was not the moment in the hallway, but the 5 years of patient work that had built the foundation for that moment to be possible. And slowly, powerfully, the whisper began to change. Where once the story had been, every wife of the Mafia boss dies young, now it became something else. Now it was every wife of the Mafia boss dies young, until she changed fate. It was no longer a curse, but a choice. It was no longer a prediction, but a possibility. It was no longer about supernatural inevitability, but about the very human power to make different decisions and accept different risks. The story spread through Sicily and eventually reached beyond to other women who were living in worlds of controlled violence, in situations where fear was the default response. And for them, the story of Giuliana became something different than it was for the Mafia families. It became proof that the narratives we inherit are not always true. It became evidence that the roles we are assigned do not have to be the roles we play. Massimo continued to lead his organization, but with a different philosophy. The territory expanded, not through aggressive conquest, but through strategic partnerships. The violence decreased, not because Massimo had become weak, but because intelligence and negotiation had proven more profitable than warfare. The empire that had been built on the bodies of dead women gradually transformed into something that did not require that particular currency to maintain itself. Giuliana bore Massimo no more children after Marco. She had decided that 2 was sufficient, that continuing to produce heirs would lock her further into a particular role and a particular limitation. She continued her studies, earned a degree in economics, and began to quietly fund initiatives that supported women leaving situations of domestic control. She never spoke publicly about her experience. She never allowed herself to become a symbol or a spokesperson. But the women who were helped by her foundations understood that there was someone who understood their situation, someone who had lived in the shadow of power and chosen to reshape it rather than be reshaped by it. Years later, when Massimo began to age and his health started to decline, he established a will that surprised the criminal world. The empire would not pass to his son, though Marco was given significant authority. Instead, Massimo designated a trust structure that gave Giuliana control over major decisions. It was an unprecedented move, a Mafia boss entrusting his legacy to his wife rather than his blood heir. But those who knew the family understood why. Giuliana had proven that she had the strategic mind, the emotional intelligence, and the commitment to preserve what Massimo had built while transforming it into something sustainable beyond his life. When Massimo finally died, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, the succession proceeded smoothly. There was no power vacuum. There was no internal warfare. There was simply a woman stepping into a role that everyone had come to understand she had been prepared for all along. The stories from that era speak of how Sicily's underworld changed when a woman took control, not because she was softer or more moral, but because she was intelligent enough to understand that sustainability required something more than fear. They speak of how the violence decreased, how the profits increased, how the organization actually functioned more efficiently when it was not constantly engaged in internal conflict and external revenge cycles. But the story that matters most, the story that would eventually travel far beyond the criminal underworld and into the culture at large, was simpler than all of that complexity. It was a story about a woman who had been told she would die young, who had refused to accept that verdict, and who had transformed not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone around her. On quiet evenings, in the years that followed, Giuliana would sit by the window of the villa that overlooked the Tyrrhenian Sea, the same villa where she had been warned on her wedding night about the curse. She would think about Isabella, Lucia, and Sophia, the women whose deaths had preceded her, whose names had become footnotes to a legend, whose suffering had written the narrative that she had then rewritten with her choices. She would never know for certain what her life would have been if she had refused Massimo that day in the rain, if she had run as he had advised her to do. But she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the choice to stay, to fight, to believe that fate was negotiable, and that choice had changed everything. The old women in the Palermo neighborhood eventually stopped crossing themselves when the name De Luca was mentioned. Instead, they began to tell a different story to the young girls who asked about fate and destiny and the possibility of escaping the roles that had been assigned to them. They told the story of Giuliana. They told it with respect and wonder and something that might have been hope. And in that way, the curse did not just end, it transformed. It became proof that the stories we tell about the future are not destiny. They are simply the stories we have told most recently, waiting to be challenged, waiting to be rewritten by someone brave enough to believe that their choices matter. The sun has set over Sicily. The story of Giuliana and Massimo has been told. But the real story, the story that matters most, is that this is not just a tale from another time and another place. This is a story about power, about choice, about the moment when someone decides that the narrative they have been given is not the narrative they will accept. Every day, people around the world are told who they are supposed to be. They are told what they are capable of and what they are not capable of. They are told that their circumstances are unchangeable, that their fate is fixed, that the best they can do is accept and endure. This is the story of a woman who refused that narrative, not through magic or supernatural intervention, but through intelligence, courage, and the quiet determination to make different choices than the ones she had been expected to make. Thank you for spending these 27 minutes with us. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself thinking about the moments in your own life when you choose to accept a narrative or challenge it, we would be deeply grateful if you would subscribe to this channel. We have many more stories to tell, stories of real people who have faced impossible circumstances and chosen to rewrite the outcomes through their choices and their commitment. Subscribe now to receive notifications for every new chapter, every new story, every new reminder that the future is not written until we write it. Thank you. Until next time.